Patch 15.4 is now on the live servers, and if in case you've been living under a rock, this is a massive patch. Changes to traits, changes to power-ups, changes to new power-ups. Actually, they introduced new ones, new system changes, new item changes, nerfing the frequency of artifacts and radiant items, etc. There is so much that has been packed into this one patch, and as you can probably guess by today's title and today's video, I wanted to specifically go over these 3 item changes: Nashor's Tooth, QSS, and Kraken. The reason being is that I think out of all of the craftable items, these 3 have experienced the most change compared to any of the other craftable items. Blue buff might be a contender to be part of that conversation, but honestly, I don't think the way you approach blue buff has changed really much in any way, except maybe you're a little more inclined to build like Deathblade or Rabadons on blue buff instead now. But these 3 items have changed the most, and actually I think that there are a lot of times where I'm watching even like top challenger players play the game that they aren't utilizing the full potential of their board, and sometimes I feel like they're missing out on some value that could have been there had they had slammed their items a little bit differently. So that's why in today's video I really wanted to talk about all of these changes. So in case, again, if you've been living under a rock, this might be news to you, and that's okay. And if you've been not living under the rock, you know what the changes are, then you can probably skip ahead a little bit. But real quick, I wanted to cover what has exactly changed. Nashor's Tooth now gives less base AP and no more mana regen. Goodbye. Instead, it provides critical chance, and actually Nashor's Tooth, to my understanding, is the only item in the game that builds out of no gloves but still provides critical strike chance, and more specifically 20%. And the old version of it, after casting ability, you would gain 40% attack speed for 5 seconds, but now attacks grant 2 bonus mana, which is increased to 4 if they critically strike. That is a very large change, and is probably the biggest change compared to all of the other items. Quicksilver also gives less base attack speed, 20% less to be precise, and now instead grants 3% stacking attack speed per second. So it's sort of a pseudo Ginsu's, right? Ginsu's gives 6% per second, but Quicksilver gives 3%. So it's half the value of a Ginsu's, but obviously to try to compensate, they have provided the item with still the CC immunity like it always has. Finally, Kraken's Fury now gives less base AD, and again, the old version of it was stack 3 AD with no limit, but now there is a hard limit, and more specifically 20 stacks. After you hit 20 stacks on Kraken, you now gain a 40% attack speed buff. So again, a lot of stuff has changed. Quicksilver and Krakens have changed, but they don't feel too different compared to their previous identity. But Nashor's Tooth is the big one that has really changed a lot in terms of its identity, and that is why, while going over all of these 3 items, I really want to cover Nashor's Tooth first. First off, ideally, you really want to try and itemize for a 100% crit chance to maximize the mana gen value. And as a reminder, all units have base 25% crit chance. That means for AP casters, building something like Strikers, JG, and Nashors alongside the base 25% crit will net you 100%. And this is likely going to be the meta build that we will be seeing in the future when it comes to AP casters. AD casters have the exact same thing, where again, in order to maximize the mana gen value, you are going to be having to itemize Strikers, IE, and Nashor's Tooth. I do want to point this out as well. Out of all of the craftable items in the game, only JG and Infinity Edge are the items that give 35%, and that 35% number is very important. Reason being is that if you build Nashors with an IE, now you still need 20% exactly in order to hit that 100% threshold. That also means that if you opt to skip out of IE, because maybe you have an augment like Water Lotus or a fruit that lets you crit, you're still lacking 35%, and unfortunately, because there are no other items that provide 35%, you might not be able to hit that 100% threshold without some other ways to boost crit chance into your board. So every other glove item in the game is giving you 20%, right? Your Last Whispers, your Hodges, your Steadfast, Quicksilver, Strikers, Thief's Glove, even the emblems like Luchador and Executioner Crest, assuming that you are not going up the Executioner tree specifically, but those all give it 20% base, right? That is really important. So actually, if you opt to skip out of IE or JG, again, you are very likely not going to be able to get that 100% threshold unless you have other ways to build crit into your board. That's why other ways to get crit, it's important to note things like Water Lotus, right? The Prismatic gives 20%, the Gold only gives 5, which is also partially the reason why you hear a lot of players not really like Water Lotus too much. Executioner, the trait itself goes up, right? The 2 gives 25, the 3-piece gives 35, 4 and 5 gives 50 and 55 respectively, right? And fruits as well. There are only 2 fruits to my understanding right now that give crit chance. Critical Threat, which gives 5% every 3 seconds, so 12 seconds would be the equivalent crit chance of something like one of these items. And Spirit Sword, which gives 20% already, but Spirit Sword actually has a very small pool of champions that's actually offered to. So, you know, the big one that I think people think of when they hear Spirit Sword, they think about Jhin. But even then, Jhin doesn't utilize mana. So he's just not part of this conversation with Nashor's Tooth. So, with all that information out of the way, in case you haven't noticed it already, there is a glaring issue though with this build. Do you see the glaring issue? I'm going to ask you this. Do you see the glaring issue here right now? If you've been prudent, you might have noticed. But these builds are lacking base stats, right? Strikers JG Nashors, or Strikers IE Nashors, or Hodge IE Nashors, or whatever it may be, right? These are all missing a stat stick, something to boost the power of the actual spell itself. There's no point in critting a spell if the spell doesn't do damage in the first place. Like, it really doesn't do that much more. So, in theory, units that get a lot of stats from their trait will benefit the most out of these kinds of changes, right? So specifically, Sorks. Yes, it is not a meta line at the moment, but if it ever does become meta, I highly believe that Strikers JG Nashors is likely going to be the meta build when it comes to playing around Karma, because that is going to really maximize the crit chance and the mana gen value as well. So these item changes in Nashors is actually a buff to lines like Karma. Edgelord as well is the stat, or rather the trait in the game that gives a bunch of AD flat. That being said, again, as we probably already know, Edgelord is not really that great of a comp right now, but this is theoretically going to be the best holders for this kind of build. Another thing to note is that there are other combinations as well, and as you can sort of tell by these sort of combinations, that generally you really do want to try to find ways to implement those flat stats somewhere and still hit that 100%. And actually, some of the best performing builds inside of here, for example, will be something like this, where Nashors plus Strikers plus something like Rabadons, right, with 3 Executioner in a line something similar to Executioner Rise, would see really good play because they're able to maximize the crit value while still being able to get flat stats built into their kit, or rather into their trait or their power or their spell, whatever you want to call it. Same thing with actually the most meta build right now for the strongest reroll line, which is going to be Veteran Mentor Katarina, right? That is the strongest reroll line at the moment, and builds like Hodge, Edge, and Knight, because you need that survivability, this still gives you 100% crit, except usually when you're playing the line, you get the 2 Executioners, so it's like 90%, but close enough, you know what I mean? So that is also a build that could really utilize these new changes, and as you'll see with Katarina itemizations, Nashor's Hodge, Edge, and Knight is going to be her best in slot. Finally, usually finding ways to also do stuff like this with like Nashors and Kraken, and then augments like Water Lotus would actually fit really, really nicely into a spot like this, because this would actually give you 100% crit. So this would be really great in a line, something like Jinx, who likes to stack and cast and do a lot of damage, but maybe it's not going to have the best way to get to 100% crit. I want to leave you guys with this. When you want to build Nashor's Tooth, and when you are considering it, just understand that trying to find that base stats of AD or AP to help boost the power of the original spell before critting it is going to be the priority, because any build that is full crit with no flat stats is going to do poorly. So that's why, again, most meta builds, if they involve Nashors, typically still include some sort of stat stick. Your Rabadons, your Archangels, your Kraken, your Deathblade, etc. So just keep that in mind. But still, very interesting in the way that we approach itemizing with Nashors. The next item I want to talk about is going to be Kraken's Fury. And Kraken, again, it does not stack infinitely anymore. So stacking it actually as soon as possible to proc that new ability is going to be the best way to garner the most value out of it. That being said, we kind of want to find our fights to end a little bit quicker than before, right? Previously, Kraken with Ginsu's was amazing because both of them stacked infinitely. So if you had something really strong in the front line, like your Colossal Udyrs, then Ginsu's and Kraken would stack up so high that you get so much attack speed and so much AD that your Ashe in the backline is just going to clear the board. So with that, compared to the old version of Kraken with infinite scaling, this is overall actually a nerf to the item, especially since the attack speed buff is what you get after 20 stacks with Kraken. That is less impactful when you pair it with something like Ginsu's, right? Because the higher you invest into a stat, the less value you get out of it compared to stacking a different stat on top of said stat, because stats work multiplicatively, right? A bunch of attack speed will work really well with a bunch of AD. Bunch of attack speed with more attack speed and still the same amount of little bit of AD, that is not going to provide nearly as much value compared to the former example. So instead, you should consider pairing Kraken with builds that utilize red buff over Ginsu for units like Jinx. Jinx is a very good example where her best in slot is probably going to be something like Kraken's red buff and strikers. She wants the fight to end quick because she gets outscaled by other comps, but still benefits greatly from hitting max stacks and proccing the Kraken bonus. Red buff also has a bunch of flat attack speed that you automatically get to use off rip that will help you stack the Kraken as soon as possible. Jinx also specifically has a built-in Ginsu for her passive, so it's just the perfect storm of changes to really garner a lot of value out of Jinx by itemizing her with stuff like red buff, Kraken, and strikers. TF as well is also a really great example of somebody who really likes his change because he already really liked Kraken red buff, and you can pair him with something like a strikers or a GS to really maximize the value you get when playing around Twisted Fate. I do want to mention this as well though, that with Kraken's Fury, again, its best holders haven't changed this current patch, meaning the comps that used to thrive with having Kraken and Ginsu's across the board have just generally gotten weaker. Things like your Colossal Udyr, things like your Jinx lines, these have gotten slightly worse compared to before when itemizing specifically Kraken Ginsu. But that does not mean you should avoid building this item, because as some of you have already figured out, there are some comps that are flying under the radar, or maybe not even under the radar at this point, but have been finding a lot of success. Things like your reroll Zaya, and even some experimental stuff like Ordinary Gnar. The final item I want to go over is going to be Quicksilver. Quicksilver, again, has become a worse version of Ginsu for melee champs, and this wouldn't be much of a problem except for the fact that fighters have changed this patch. So fighters used to have built-in Omnivamp, so you could actually justify skipping the Omnivamp items because you could itemize other things, so things like your Titans, your Quicksilvers, your Edge of Knights, right? But this is no longer the case. Instead, now fighters, just to refresh your memory, gain scaling attack speed as the game continues up to 30% starting from stage 5. That is a lot of base attack speed, and quite honestly, it's enough that you could probably justify not building something like a Quicksilver, but instead something like a Titans, which also provides CC immunity and actually until the end of the fight, but also provides a bunch of better stats overall, a bunch of AD, AP, and a bunch of armor MR. So Quicksilver, at least as of the beginning of this patch, it's difficult to say if it even really has a place. Yone has been the only one at all in the stats that seem to have decent stats, but if you can get to Yone, any item is kind of good at that point. So I personally don't really think Quicksilver is going to be seeing much play at all in the meta, and again, I think it's an item that, despite the fact that it was not seeing play before, it might be even seeing even less play because it just doesn't have a spot. Titans does its job better, and fighter classes will compensate for the lack of attack speed. And not to mention, QSS built out of a glove and out of a cloak, which are very integral components when it comes to finding your Sunder, your Even Shrouds, your Last Whispers, and Glove is great in IE, in Hodge. There are just too many good items that build out of these components for an item that feels, quite honestly, pretty worthless and out of place. So that is where I kind of want to end today's video, but if you have any questions or you have anything that you've noticed or you want to point out, please leave in the comments. I'd love to hear it. But I hope this was helpful. I hope this gave you a little bit more insight into the item changes, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. And let me know, by the way, if you found this interesting or helpful. I'll try to make more of this kind of informational content in the future. But until then, take care, guys. Happy clapping.